Welcome back, everybody. While the pandemic has been a challenge for everyone, women have borne the brunt of economic fallout, all while managing crises on the front lines and caring for their families at home.
To capture this reality, our next guest spoke to dozens of women across Canada for her new book, Women of the Pandemic, Stories from the Front Lines of COVID-19. Author McKeon joins us today. Welcome back to the show, Lauren.
Hi, thanks for having me.
So you start this book by saying that the story of the pandemic has actually been the story of women. So how has this pandemic and the She-cession that we're experiencing right now been historic for women in particular?
You know, when we talk about She-cession, it's really the first time in history, in the history of crises, that women have borne the brunt of an economic recession. So that's huge. We know that 12 times as many mothers as fathers have had to leave their jobs to care for children. We know that the industries where women predominantly make up the majority of employees have been the hardest hit. And we also know that women have been slower to return to work. And, you know, beyond that, they've been the ones who predominantly have been juggling, you know, working and mothering from home, emotional caretaking. They've been on the front lines, essential workers. You know, I've spoken to so many women that have said, I just had this moment during the pandemic where maybe I lost my job or I lost my business or I was trying to do 20 things at home at once. And I was just like, oh my God, how can I keep doing this? And I think, you know, these are the stories that we need to hear and that we need to think about as we start thinking about recovery.
Yeah, no kidding. So you spoke at length also to sort of the less acknowledged frontline workers, women, hospital workers, truck drivers, meat factory workers, for example. How were their pandemic experiences really unique?
Yeah, I think at the beginning of the pandemic, we really had this myth pushed forward that the pandemic was going to be the great equalizer. And, you know, we'd all experience it the same and we'd know how, you know, each other was feeling. And we know that's really not the case. Many women have experienced it in much more tragic ways than others. And, you know, even across women, a lot of women have been put at higher risk, have not been taken care of, have been more vulnerable. And certainly those women that you just mentioned have been the ones that have borne the brunt of our social failures. I spoke to one meat packer worker who said, you know, no one ever hears our stories unless one of us dies. And that just was like a gut punch because it's so true. And we haven't, you know, they've been going to work every day so that society can function as best as it can, but we don't know their stories yet. And we need to hear them.
The word resilience comes up a lot when we're having discussions around the pandemic. It's a fraught word, but it can also be an inspiring one. So after talking to the dozens of women who were really struggling across the country over the past year and a half, what did you learn about resilience?
Certainly, even though, you know, I just finished saying we've all had diverse experiences and we need to acknowledge those diverse experiences. Resilience is one common thread and has been a common thread across, you know, I did 50 plus interviews with women and they all spoke of resilience. But as you just said, it's a fraught word. And I will never forget a conversation that I had with one young woman in North Preston, which is Canada's oldest historical Black community, who rallied her community and fought to get them a COVID testing site because you know, she was worried that they wouldn't have one because the community has been so notoriously underserved. And she said to me, I am, you know, awed by the resilience I see around me. I'm resilient myself, but why do I have to be resilient? You know, why am I the one and why is my community the one that goes without services? And we know that resilience is really born out of trauma and a lack of care and a lack of services. And I think that the pandemic has underscored that double-edged sword and why it is so tragic that so many women have to be so resilient.
You mentioned this stat a little earlier that in Canada, 12 times as many mothers than fathers have had to leave the workforce in order to stay home and care for their children. So with this discussion of women in the pandemic is also hand in hand a discussion about childcare. So where do you see, especially in light of the big federal announcement about national or universal childcare, what do you think the discussion will be about childcare post-pandemic?
I think, childcare is something that women rights advocates have been fighting for decades. And it took a pandemic to make any movement on it, which is a lot about how we think about childcare. And I think this conversation will continue to only show us how needed childcare is, how necessary it is for women to participate fully in the economy, for them to participate fully at home, just for them to have the opportunities that they so deserve, that women just deserve to have, especially going forward as we think about recovery and what we want that to look like. I do think, though, that we have to remember that it's not the end of the conversation. Women need to have jobs to go back to, and we need to create those jobs and those opportunities for them for meaningful work.
We've seen so much female leadership, as particularly from the healthcare fields, during this pandemic, and I think they've been celebrated as much as they've been criticized. I'm thinking about Dr. Theresa Tam, British Columbia's Dr. Bonnie Henry, Alberta's Dr. Dina Hinshaw, and many, many others. It's been inspiring to see them. My heart goes out to them sometimes as well when I see rhetoric on Twitter. But what do you think that women in this pandemic have taught us about effective leadership?
So much. My previous book, No More Nice Girls, came out about 10 days before the pandemic, and it was all about women in leadership. And it was arguing that we needed to embrace women leaders, that we needed more women leaders, we needed more diverse leadership, and we needed to move away from this sort of macho, egotistical leader that we've really embraced, worldwide in the past 5 years. And we needed to lead with community and kindness and empathy and compassion and care for people. And that seemed like such a long ways away when that book came out for me. It was very future looking. And I think if there's any silver lining to the pandemic is that we have seen women leaders shine. And we've seen that that type of kind, caring, compassionate leadership works and that people respond to it. We saw I spoke to leaders who cried on TV and said, I thought I was going to be vilified. And in fact, people reached out and said, that made you just seem more human and more caring. And, we also know there are studies that have come out that show worldwide women-led countries have done better in terms of death because they have led with that kindness and that compassion. And I think any door that opens to women leadership and to embracing women leadership and to pushing more of it is definitely a good thing. We want to see more of that.
Jacinda Ardern from New Zealand comes to mind as one. Listen, let's talk about normal. A lot of people are like, okay, this talk about getting back to normal after the COVID-19 pandemic, but we've learned in this, normal is not working for a lot of women. So what do you think what would you think ideal recovery would look like to you?
Yes, the idea of normal, returning to normal, I understand it. Of course, we all want to be able to go back to restaurants and to see our friends and our family and feel safe doing so. But it is ridiculous in a lot of ways because, and so many women that I spoke to said this too, the pandemic hasn't created the problems, but it has exacerbated them and it's made them sort of undeniable. We can't look away from it. So when we think about recovery, I think that we need to hear these women's stories, stories that we're not used to hearing. We need to hear those stories of the most vulnerable people during the pandemic, the people we did let down, the people who are frontline workers or essential workers who desperately need paid sick days, who do need childcare, who haven't been vaccinated as quickly, who are in communities that have higher rates, and think about how we failed them and move forward in a recovery that finally puts them first.
Lauren, thanks so much for joining us today and sharing your insights.
Thanks for having me.
The book is called Women of the Pandemic, and you can find it everywhere now. Don't go anywhere. We'll be right back.